So what I'm going to discuss tonight is, this is from an actual customer that I've been working with for the past little over a year now. Actually, pretty much the entire time I've been at CCG with a few exceptions. And so I'll be talking about sort of their journey and moving to the cloud. They've used a couple different pieces of the IBM cloud, along with having Cognos installed on these. So I'll run through that and discuss some of that. So this is just kind of a quick overview what I'll be doing. Talking about the typical on-premise installation, then kind of what happens, what's the difference with that versus the infrastructure as a service. You may have heard, I forget when exactly it was, but IBM acquired a company a few years ago, SoftLayer, and that's what they've been using. That's their cloud infrastructure. So I'll be discussing that a little bit, and then the software as a service that we've now migrated them over to completely. So just a quick introduction, who I am. My name's Norm, and I've been with CCG a little over a year now, but I've been doing consulting and working with Cognos and stuff. I guess with Cognos it's going on 17 years now. I started with Cognos and then went through the acquisition with IBM and all that stuff and stayed for a little while longer, I guess 4 or 5 years, if it's on some sort of automatic thing. Just a quick background, this customer, it's a large construction company, and they were actually one of the, if not the first, large Cognos installations that we actually did, or that anyone actually did. The first install, because Cognos 11 came out in, was it December or so, 2015, and we were working with it in January at this customer. We got it set up in the infrastructure as a service, the SoftLayer stuff with IBM. That was our original setup. And then partway through the year, I guess around August, we did a POC with the cloud stuff, the SaaS model that IBM has. For the most part, it had everything that we needed, minus a couple small things, but it was something the customer was willing to live with, so they didn't have to support all that infrastructure, plus the skill set of maintaining Cognos and things like that. These are some of the benefits that I'll get into later on with moving to the SaaS model. It really depends on your skill set that you have in-house. So this is just a quick architecture overview of what we had initially set up. Now, when I'm talking with the infrastructure versus the on-premise installation, they're still the same. Really the big difference is that with the infrastructure, you're not hosting the servers and any load balancers that are potentially needed and so on. IBM is hosting those in the SoftLayer install. So we still had to architect out what we needed, what was required based on the customer requirements. They actually had 4 environments, dev, QA, UAT, production, or we still have 4. But this just kind of gives you an idea of what was there. I won't go into the architecture too much. Those of you that have worked with Cognos or some of the infrastructure stuff, this will probably look familiar. And even if you haven't, this isn't that different than other applications too, as far as, having servers, firewalls, load balancers, all that sort of stuff. So with your typical on-premise installation, to accommodate what we had there in that architecture, they would have needed to spin up all their machines, their servers, VMs, if they were using VMs, whatever host they had for hosting the VMs. So, they need to have all that stuff, load balancers and everything as well. Plus, then you have to go about doing your Cognos installation. You have to administer it. You have to back up those servers. You have to, maintain any patches, Windows patches, Linux, whatever it is that you're using. And that requires that you've got some in-house knowledge about installing Cognos, administering it. You need to know all those things, and troubleshooting it, maintaining it, performance tuning, and all that stuff. So there's a lot of responsibility there, and I'm sure a lot of you already have this. IT departments are pretty stressed right now as far as the amount of work that you're doing and everything that you've got involved in there. So people are looking to try and offload some of that, and then there's costs and so on as well. So one way to offload that is to go with the infrastructure as a service. And so in this case, what you're doing is, instead of hosting everything on premise, on site, you're utilizing, in this case, we're utilizing IBM's SoftLayer, their cloud, and so that's where everything resided. But just like the on-premise installation, we still had to go through the process of figuring out how many, what do we need for that infrastructure? How many servers are we going to need for Cognos? What's the content store going to be in? SQL Server, DB2, those types of things. We had to figure out, load balancers, firewalls, all these different things as well. But then with the infrastructure, what happens is, once you architect that stuff out, instead of giving it to your IT department to then spin up the VMs and whatever it is, you give it to IBM, and they spin up those machines because they're hosting it for you. And you've got a combination of things too, where you can do virtual machines, or you can do what they call bare metal servers, which are actual physical servers. What we had done for this is, all the Cognos servers, they were actually virtual machines, but we were using DB2, being IBM. The DB2 database servers that were hosting the content store, audit store, and notification store, and so on, that we had for Cognos, those were on these physical servers, these bare metal servers. So they were actual servers that IBM was still hosting. But then once they spun those up for us, now most of the responsibility was back on us. We had to install it. We had to configure Cognos. We had to set up backup of the servers. So we had to work with the customer's IT department and the team responsible for the servers. They had to go, we had a backup server in the SoftLayer cloud, but then they had to go through the process of setting everything up, making sure the server's backed up, and so on. So what it saved them was things like the capital costs of server purchases and spinning up the VMs and the VM host and all that stuff. But ultimately, once that's done, the rest of it was still our responsibility, where we had to install everything, we had to configure it, maintain it, back it up, all those things, even, a lot of troubleshooting within Cognos and so on as well. So what the customer really wanted, because, for us to, for them to totally take over things themselves, getting someone and the skill set to manage the Cognos installation and the administration and all that stuff, they were having a hard time finding someone, but they also didn't really want that responsibility either. They wanted to mainly provide the BI solution, build the reports, provide that to their end users and so on, without all the added burden of this. And so what happened is, in August, we actually set up a POC, and the way it works with IBM is that you can, if you want to do a POC, I think it was 2 weeks. Typically it's 2 weeks, but because they were a large customer and spent a lot of money, they were able to stretch it out a little longer. So if you got that card, you can play it, with IBM. And so they set up a POC environment for us to then be able to test things out and make sure that everything worked the way that the customer wanted, and then they could make the decision. So in the setup for this, they already had, IBM already had an existing environment, and that they just recycle through customers. And that was when we finally had to give it up. It's because they were pressuring us, because they're like, we've got another customer we need to give this to, or potential customer. And so there was a couple things we had to do. The first thing was set up the communication between IBM and the customer. And so they had to set up this VPN tunnel, virtual private network, to communicate between the IBM software, because IBM hosts all their cloud stuff in their own software environment. So we had to, the network team of the customer had to work with IBM to get that set up. And once that was set up, then it came over to me to help with the customer doing the POC. And so we had to provide some information to them as far as connecting to our security on-premise, so the Active Directory information and a couple other things. We had to give IBM a deployment file, because what happens is now they're hosting everything. So that deployment folder, when you want to move stuff from one environment to another, you don't have that. You have to FTP the file or whatever, or if it's small. In this case, for the POC, it was small, so I could just email it to them. And then they put it in the deployment folder, and then we had to import it ourselves and so on. So right there, what happens with the SaaS model, there's a system administrator role, and if you're not familiar with Cognos, the system administrator role is basically God in Cognos and can do anything. And so what happens now in the SaaS model is that IBM is the system administrator. And then what you have to do is you have to go in and start setting up your own administrator stuff, like directory administrator for doing data source connections, report administration for managing reports, and so on. So right there, some of the responsibility is now IBM's, not your IT department. So there's some things like that. And so we went through the POC and everything, and we had a couple things. The main thing that currently that they don't have, and I think, is it on this slide or the next one? Yeah, they don't have single sign-on set up in their SaaS model with Cognos, but it is a high priority for them. It's something they're working with their development team to have set up, and it's something that they're hoping to have. They don't know when exactly. Last we heard from the cloud ops team, they're hoping to have it, sometime early this year. I mean, it's March now, so we'll see. There is a new release, I think Mary mentioned, there is a new release of Cognos that's coming out very shortly. So maybe that will have some changes that the cloud ops team will be able to use. I don't know, we'll see. So, but other than that, we could do pretty much everything else that we needed to do. And so the customer said, yeah, let's go ahead, we're going to do that. And so by moving to this SaaS model, what we didn't have to do was install, configure, set up Cognos. All we had to do was tell IBM, yes, this is what we're going to do. Here's how many users we have. Here's how many environments, and we go. Now, the way IBM does it, they have something called a prod and pre-prod. Basically, you get one instance, and they provide two. And that's what they call them. Well, our customer, we had 4. So they had to go back to IBM and say, well, we need 4 because that's the way things work. And so what happened is they got 2 instances, and one with a prod, one with a pre-prod. What I learned later that would have been nice to know earlier is that these instances do share a deployment folder, so that when you want to deploy from one environment to another, you can run the export in one, run the import in the other. But because we've got 2, they don't there is a spot where they don't. And what happened with us is our dev and UAT ended up on one instance, QA and production ended up on another. So we have to open tickets constantly with IBM to migrate from dev to QA. If we had known, we would have had dev QA on the same. Then we would have only had to open tickets for UAT, because then we go QA to UAT. Because UAT, once they sign off, well, it's the same file as production would need, and we'd be able to just import it into production. So it would have made our life a little easier. But other than that, the experience has been pretty good. The environment, it's all, IBM has it all SSL encrypted and everything. So that's one thing that's a little different too. If you have not done a lot of the SSL stuff, like installed Framework Manager, for instance, in an SSL environment, IBM, what they do is in your actual software, when you log into your environment, it actually has a Framework Manager folder, and it has all the instructions and all the SSL certificates and everything that you need to set it up. So it was it was the first time I had done it. It was a bit of a learning curve, but the instructions, if you do it, you should benefit from it, because I told them what was wrong in their instructions and what wasn't. So anyways, it's been a pretty good move. And even while we were going through this, when they first spun up our environments, what happens is when you decide to move ahead, IBM sends you this welcome letter, and what it is it's some information about your environment, what your URL links are, and so on. But also what it has is a bunch of information for you to fill out. And what you need to fill out is things like, your security source that you're connecting to on site, your Active Directory in our case. Our databases where our data resides are on premise as well. So we had to provide some information about those. And our network team had to work with IBM to make sure that those on-premise items could be communicated with through IBM, through the VPN tunnel. So then what happens is after you fill that in and send it to IBM, then they go and work with your network team to set up that communication and anything else that needs to be set up to communicate with those on-premise servers and so on. And then this is the step where it then came back to me, where IBM had it set up with just a generic LDAP server that they have, but they also had our Active Directory configured in there, and they give you credentials to log into their LDAP, and then you log into your own as well, and then you set up all your administrator access. When you tell IBM you're done, they remove theirs. You'll still see it there, but it's disabled, so you can't ever get to it. And then the last thing is to migrate your content and start going from there. And so that's all done through deployment files. Versus if you went from an on-premise to an infrastructure like we did initially, this customer, they were starting at an infrastructure. That was their starting point. But if you go from an on-premise to an infrastructure, you could do it by taking a backup of your content store and bringing it over to your environment, because you've got control over it. Here, you don't, because IBM has set up that content store. They've done whatever stuff behind the scenes. And so, in our different environments too, because we got dev, QA, production, and so on, we have a different number of dispatchers in each environment, but IBM just sets that up based on what our user requirements are. If we need to add users down the road and it's going to require another dispatcher, one will just show up suddenly. And the thing with the cloud stuff is that this was one thing I had to get with some people that I was working with there. That had come in, and they were they were familiar with Cognos and so on, and so they kept asking all these questions about well, what about this, about the server, what about that? I'm like, forget that. You don't need to know it. I mean, IBM's got all that stuff. We just have to focus on our Cognos development now. And so that's where we're at now. And so we've been on it for, I guess, live for 2-3 months now. But the initial stuff we had set up in September, it doesn't take that long to get up and running. We ran into a couple things where the customer was slow for a while signing off on some things, so that kind of delayed things. And then we also ran into an unplanned feature in 1105. We were using and we still are using an active report that when we had the initial setup, it was done on 1103 for the SaaS. But in that time, 1104 came out, and so we were going to have them upgrade the cloud to the newest release. Well, just as we opened the ticket with IBM to do it and started arranging, 1105 came out. So the customer's like, well, and there was new stuff in there that they wanted to use. So they're like, well, no one's using it yet. Let's go with the newest thing. So that was the other thing. We just had to tell IBM, yeah, we want to go with this release. You work with them, they do the upgrade, and they say, okay, it's up and running again. And so, that's a nice thing with the cloud stuff as well, especially with the way they were doing things in the last year with version 11, where they were releasing a new release every couple months. And there was a lot of new bug fixes and a lot of new features. I mean, they're adding quite a bit each release as well. So that made it a little smoother also. So I could talk more if you have more questions, because I know we have a limited amount of time, but if you have any questions or whatever, we can take a few minutes